without further ado, I'm happy to turn it over to Fred.
Thank you very much. Thank you for my first opportunity a year and a half to do this. I'm really desperately tired of talking to a computer screen. But I'm going to run away after this to do just that. In order to come here and do this in person, I am missing a conference in Croatia. And so I have to give my paper at that conference at 11:45. So I have to be out of here in time to set up my computer in another room. I'm really pleased to be asked to do this kind of a talk, although being asked to do a career retrospective talk means you're old. I'm not quite to the tell us how it was in the old days grandpa stage yet, but this is an interesting thing. I've never had to do anything like this before, so I'm not entirely sure how it's going to go. But what I really wanted to do was to, rather than just say I worked on this project and then I worked on that project and I worked on this project, was to have some theme to it. And because I started in the craft world as a shipwright and then became an academic and then moved into the museum world, as we say in Sweden, the red thread, the thing that links all the things I've done together, is a very strong focus on the interaction between practical and academic knowledge. And my firm belief that people who hold their knowledge in their hands have just as much to contribute to understanding the past as those who have their knowledge in their heads. Samuel Peeps, who was the Secretary of the English Navy in the 1660s and 70s and 80s, was fascinated as a professional bureaucrat in the technical workings of all the things he was supposed to manage. And so he was constantly asking craftsmen and professionals who did everything from buy timber to make sails to build ships to write treatises for him that would explain in terms he could understand what it was they did so that he could manage it more efficiently. And he wrote in his diary about these people that one of the things that occasionally frustrated him was they hold their knowledge all confused in their hands, meaning that he had enormous respect for what they knew, but trying to get them to tell him in a comprehensible way was always a stretch. Because I value that craft tradition, it's something that's informed all the work that I do. I'm in this photograph from 2014. I'm actually teaching a boat building course for archaeologists on the west coast of Ireland that we organized as a one-week seminar in order to bring my archaeological colleagues who work on ships up to speed with what really happens in a boatyard. And we did this in a working boatyard that's in a castle ruin. It's the coolest place you've ever been, although it's fallen down around your ears. Because what I discovered in the course of my career, and that always frustrated me, was that there are a large number of my colleagues in maritime archaeology who write extremely learned tomes about how ships were built in the distant past, but they do not themselves know which end of a hammer you hold on to. They write books about how sailing wind patterns affected trade patterns and that sort of thing, but they can't actually sail a boat themselves. And so very often they come to conclusions that any practical person would discount immediately, because you look at it and say, well, that's not actually possible. And I've spent my career trying to make it clear to my colleagues that you need some sort of practical knowledge in order to inform your academic knowledge. And the way I tend to think of this is the difference between real and imagined experience. People who do things have real experience of doing things. But a large part of the academic world and a large part of the management world, sorry, Kristen, is based not on real experience but imagined experience. We construct safety protocols not based on looking at actuarial data of what kinds of accidents occur in these environments. We imagine all the horrible things that might go wrong and then try to construct some sort of safety protocol around them. COVID's a good example. One of the big struggles within this pandemic has been can we take any actual knowledge of what's really happening in the world in the hospitals and use that to construct safety and health protocols, or are we imagining horrors and constructing our protocols on that basis? We had this argument in my museum all the time about protecting our visitors from the ship. And one of the questions, we have two people on our staff who have very vivid imaginations, and they're constantly imagining things that could go wrong. And my question to them is always, well, we've had 30 million visitors through the museum, literally, in the last 30 years. So how many of them has this happened? Well, none. All right, that means statistically there is less than a 1 in 30 million chance that this is going to happen. You have statistically a higher chance of winning the lottery, being struck by lightning, or if you look at the number of people in the United States who claim they've been abducted by space aliens, you have a higher chance of being abducted by space aliens than you do of banging your head on the underside of Vasa. And it's that attempt to get through real experience and the value of it that's been at the heart of all the stuff I've done. I started, as was mentioned, as an apprentice shipwright at Mystic Seaport in 1982 and 1983. And what I was mostly doing initially was working on the restoration of the Charles W. Morgan. I'm pleased to say in the recent restoration, they did not take out anything I put in. Every time I go there, I check. If you want to see my work, I did a lot of the deck framing for the upper deck, and I framed in the big skylight over the captain's cabin. I'm very proud of that, and I hope it lasts a long time. I also eventually became a shipkeeper responsible for a lot of general maintenance of all different kinds of the collection. A lot of pumping, washing, moving boats, hauling boats, launching boats, a lot of painting and scraping. And as a result, I got a very broad background in the practical aspects of how to work with boats, as well as what you can and can't do with wood and metal. In addition to that, I also worked when I was a graduate student in a machine shop that rebuilt car and truck engines. And so I developed a practical experience there that's come in very handy. And in fact, that practical experience got me my first paying job in archaeology. Not as an archaeologist, but as a mechanic on an excavation. I just got to come full circle on this experience. Last year, I'm a sailor and a board member for the Kalmar-Nickel Foundation, and a watch chief. And so I was part of the crew last year that took the ship from Wilmington up to Mystic Seaport, did 4 weeks of maintenance and haul out, and then sailed the ship back. And so it was nice to be back at Mystic Seaport. Although one of my colleagues jokes, so 38 years ago you were a grunt scraping bottom paint off of ships in this slip, and now 38 years later, after a PhD and being a professor at Cambridge, you're scraping gunk off the bottom of boats in this slip. I said, yeah, well, that's what success is like, man. I also have some practical sailing experience as an undergraduate. I did the Sea Education Association Sea semester, sailing westward from Cape Cod to South America. It was a great trip. We rode the edge of a hurricane down the Atlantic, port tack for 17 straight days. It was awesome. And we set the SEA record for the fewest engine hours in a 6-week cruise. It was great. And the only problem we had is that we happened to be en route when the US invaded Grenada, which was our destination. And so the State Department called us and said, you can't go to Grenada, we blew up your dock.
Oh no.
So we went to Beckwith instead. So I got to hang out with people who still hunt whales from open boats. That was a lot of fun. I didn't get to go whaling though. Oh man, that would have been great. Wrong season. The craft tradition informs what I still do. I have to do something with my hands, or if I just work with my head all day, I will go insane. And so I do a lot of stuff that is not necessarily cerebral. I make musical instruments. This is England's leading nautical archaeologist, John Adams, who is also England's leading blues guitarist. And he and I traded. He's also a painter, so he did a painting for me and I made a guitar for him. I like metal work, so I'm casting my own plane bodies and bronze and that sort of thing. And this occupies a considerable amount of my time when I'm not doing archaeology. As a student, after my undergraduate years, I went to Texas A&M, which specialized in nautical archaeology. I was lucky enough to have the light bulb moment in the spring of 1982 when one of the people who worked with George Bass and Fred Van Dornick, a woman named Faith Henschel, who just passed away last week, in fact, came and gave a lecture about nautical archaeology to the students, those of us who worked at Mystic Seaport. And I had the moment of, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to take this practical knowledge I've acquired in the shipyard, and I want to go look at ancient ships. And so I became a graduate student there once I finished college, studied with George Bass, the father of underwater archaeology, as he was called. He also just died. Although Frederick Van Dornick, whom we all called Uncle Fred, after I joined the faculty at A&M, we were two Freds, and so he was Uncle Fred and I was young Fred, or Big Fred and Little Fred. But the museum guards in Turkey where we worked, he was old Fred and I was young Fred. He wasn't so happy about that. So I studied maritime archaeology there, and there developed the three main interests I've had throughout the years I've been doing that since. I started there 37 years ago, 1984. And my interests have then been maritime economics. I went and did a master's degree at Cambridge in England in medieval economic history to brush up that. The history of shipbuilding and seafaring technology, and that's fairly broadly interpreted. I'm also very interested in rigging, military hardware that you put on ships, that kind of thing. And then I'm very interested in the social side of shipboard communities, because I've been part of one. I'm fascinated by how they work. To what degree does a shipboard society reflect the society that produced it, and to what degree is it its own thing? We tend to say that ships are societies in microcosm, which is not true. They are a society and they are small, but they are not a mirror of the society that put them together. For one thing, the demographics are all way off, because you just don't have the same mix of old and young, male and female on a ship that you do on society on land. And you also have the living accommodation creates very specific demands. I'm fascinated by those questions. That's one of the research topics we're doing at the Vasa Museum currently. While a student, I got to do work underwater at Port Royal, which was destroyed in an earthquake in 1692 on the south coast of Jamaica. It's near the airport if you fly to Kingston, by the way. And about 2/3 of the city collapsed or sank into the sea. And then about a third of it remained there, was not reclaimed. And Texas A&M had a 10-year project excavating there. I worked there in the summer of '85 as the mechanic because they'd come back from the previous season with 2 diesel engines that ran the compressors for the air and airlifts that did not work anymore. Mostly because they'd been using this local diesel fuel, which was full of Jamaican lizard snot. And the injectors and everything were all gummed up. So I dismantled them, cleaned them out, and made them work again, and then got offered a job to be the mechanic. So I changed a lot of oil and cleaned stuff, and also learned to dive and excavate. And this was a city site rather than a shipwreck, but it's a good place, and it was very shallow. The water was so shallow that if you got into diving trouble, you stand up and get your head out of the water. And so it meant you could dive for 3 hours at a stretch. So you got an enormous amount of practical experience in doing excavation. The field of archaeology has changed, moving away from that kind of practical experience into ever more theoretical venues. And so students today just don't get that kind of experience. I spent 12 weeks doing that 6 days a week, 3 hours a day underwater, and then processing the finds afterwards. There was a real insistence on the craft of archaeology and getting your technical skills, your hand skills up to speed that just is not taught anymore. I was lucky enough to be a student in the last phase of classical underwater archaeology. As a student, I also went to Turkey, which was where Texas A&M did most of its work, and did several projects there at various phases. This was a site that was excavated while I was in high school from the Middle Ages, and I was involved in the conservation of it. Here it is near Rhodes on the southwest corner of Turkey. Its main cargo was glass, about 1 million broken shards of glass. It was a 25-year project to put them back together into all their original types of cups, bowls, beakers, lamps, everything. I was not involved in that, thank God. But it also had substantial hull remains of one of the earliest ships we know of built in what we consider the modern manner, where you put the frames up first and then lay the planks over them. So we spent a lot of time working with this hull, which is only about 50 feet long. And I, as a student, I had the opportunity, because of my craft background, they said, oh, well, you know stuff about tools, right? So I got the opportunity to publish all the tools that were found with the ship, which include, ignore the sword on the right, a little side axe, a big double-bitted felling axe. The other thing is an adze, and also the oldest surviving caulking irons in the world. They had been misidentified as chisels, but you could see the original edges were either blunt or hollowed, like a modern chisel, like a modern caulking iron, but they're narrow like butt irons that you use today, or trundle irons. And I got to look at the weighing equipment, which is mostly because nobody else would do it. And I was standing around with nothing in my hands at that moment. So, well, Fred, why don't you do that? And so looking at all the weights and measures, which is also applying practical, mathematical, and commercial knowledge to what do you need to be able to do business in 3 different cultures. You need 3 different sets of weights. And then my main job, however, was working with the reassembly of the hull remains. And then I got to do, for 2 summers, I built this, which was a full-scale reconstruction of a section of the side of the ship that we then loaded with the original cargo from that part of the ship. And so, once again, being a shipwright paid off. I got to do an interesting project there. And also it gave me a chance to look in detail at how that ship was built and get a sense of this early phase in the development of modern shipbuilding. I also, while I was there, participated in one of the most spectacular excavations of the 20th century, and I'm only going to tell you about this because I get to brag for just a minute. And this was a ship from over 3,000 years ago that sank, piled into the south shore of what's now Turkey at quite a large, great depth. The upper end of the site's 150 feet deep, and the bottom end is 200 feet deep. And so it was very short dives over an 11-year process, 11-season process. And it's over here, down the southern coast of Turkey. And its main cargo was copper ingots. It was the raw materials of the Bronze Age. This was a major military disaster for someone. There's enough copper and tin on this ship to completely equip the largest army we know of from the Bronze Age. This would be the equivalent to that country of the US losing an entire US aircraft carrier battle group. It included some of the earliest glass that we know of, and the oldest book in the world, which is which had wax in these hollows that you would then write in with a stylus. We were always disappointed we didn't find the wax, because wax survives underwater. And we were sure it was an inventory of what was on the ship. It would have been great if we'd known that. But my task was really much more mundane. Because I was the carpenter, I got to build the excavation camp. I was taken off my archaeological work, and I didn't get to work here really very much. I got to be a guest for a week. But I helped paste this excavation camp to the side of a cliff for a week in May of 1986. But I did then get, as a thanks for that, I got to come and work for 1 week. I got to dive once and see the site, and then I got to sit and register and clean artifacts. But during that 1 week, we brought up this. And I got to record it. And there's a picture of it sitting in my hand in National Geographic magazine. It's a gold scarab, and it says on it, these 3 feathers, the Egyptian word for feather is nefer. Nefer, nefer, nefer. And what this means, if you translate it, is, see, the beautiful one has come. But it's actually somebody's name, Nefertiti. So the Queen Nefertiti you've heard of, this was her personal scarab that later ended up as a piece of scrap gold 50 years after she had died. And we raised it on from that wreck. That was cool. Hair still stands up on the back of my neck when I tell you about that. I worked for a couple of seasons in the Netherlands, really honing my skills at recording hull remains. One of the ships I worked on, the OB-71, was a passenger ferry that sank in about 1625, but had been built in 1587. Been in service for almost 40 years. And it was heavily repaired, but it's the same size as Dove with the same rig. So we've been stealing a lot of details from that vessel to put over there. Because it tells us, because it's so well preserved, including the deck and all of the rigging hardware, it gives us a good idea of the geometry of how that rig works, where you belayed things. And it was possible to figure out all of that, partly because I've been sailing on big ships. And then I also worked on the recording of a 15th century cog, Almeida Vike 13. And then later, as a result of that, I am now a registered naval architect in Sweden. The city of Malmö on the west coast of Sweden decided they wanted to build a copy of it as the training vessel to teach people how to sail a cog for their big cog that was a copy of one found at Malmö. And so I spent 2 years ferrying myself or shuttling back and forth between my job in Denmark and Malmö to do drawings and supervise the construction of this medieval vessel, which was another good learning experience to see if what I had reconstructed on paper could actually be built in timber. That's an extra good test of your academic chops if you can turn it into reality. And then the first excavation I directed after I finished my degree and had become a professor was in the United States. All this work I'd done in Europe, I'd never worked in the US, but I was asked to go look at a vessel that had been found in the Savannah River near Savannah, Georgia. And it was a vessel of this type, one of these little over-rigged coastal sloops that were used for coastal traffic up and down the east coast of the American colonies, and for traffic between the American colonies and the Caribbean. So this is the kind of vessel that might have visited here in the 1770s or 1780s. And it was found, and it had been used as cribbing to fix a blowout in a rice bank on a rice plantation. This is all old rice plantation. Here you can see the canals and ditches for flooding and draining. And right here, the stern of a vessel started to erode out of the bank. This is a survey of what the bank looked like beforehand, reconstruction of it. You can see the outline there of the stern of a small vessel that's coming out of the bank. And so in 1992, and you can also see all these pilings, which are the remains of a pier that were built over that vessel. So the vessel is also the foundation for a pier, because the man who owned all of the land in this area from 1745 onwards built his house right there. So this is his pier. And there's all kinds of domestic trash that we found in the mud, fine glasswares and porcelain and that sort of thing, because he was a wealthy fellow. The vessel is here. You can see the house site is right behind it. But there's lots of rice culture stuff, including an abandoned threshing mill from before Sherman arrived in 1863 and burned everything to the ground. And so we excavated on land at low tide. The range of tide here is 10 feet. And so rather than diving in muddy water at high tide, we decided to dig in mud at low tide. And in the course of 3 weeks, we moved 90 tons of clay by hand with 7 people. And so this is actually my wife here, who came along, and one of the students from Texas A&M, as we're excavating up towards the bow, which had been sawn off, missing the stem. This woman is standing up, because you just gradually churn the mud up. She's trying to record the keel underneath, so she's standing in this mud. And this is the hole we eventually dug to expose the entire vessel. And this is what was left. Pretty much most of the starboard side, except for the bow, up to the deck. And then it had been deliberately staked in and jammed in place to stabilize the bank. We had help. Those 2 little bumps in the water are the eyes and nostrils of an alligator that hung out at the bottom of the site for the entire time we were there. Now, that's partly our fault. When we didn't finish our sandwiches, we were feeding the gators. But he was calm about it. He didn't try to come up on shore and bother us. But it was one of the practical aspects of doing this site was dealing with the wildlife. When I talked to the landowner about doing a project there, I said, so do I need to worry about the snakes, rattlesnakes and copperheads that are endemic to the river? And he said, no, I wouldn't worry about the snakes. I said, Why not? He said, well, the gators eat them. Oh, so I should worry about the alligators. No, you don't have to worry about them. I said, holy crap, what eats alligators? And he said, no, just don't get between a gator and the water and don't bother the young ones. You'll be fine. I said, so what should I worry about? Pigs, feral pigs. They're bad-tempered and territorial. If you hear snorting, get out in the water. He said, what do you recommend? I said, I think you should carry a pig gun. A pig gun? I said, yeah, sawed-off shotgun. All right, so when I was preparing, I went to the local gun dealer and said, I need a pig gun. Oh yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's a thing. And it's a short-barreled shotgun with a pistol grip. And I said, well, I'm walking around in hip-deep mud. He said, oh, and you need a back holster. This is starting to get complicated. And so I said, that's still not going to be very practical, and I have to cross state lines every day. It's going to be a pain. He said, well, you could have a .45 pistol. It might discourage him a little. I said, you know, my luck, I just get angry with a student and shoot him. So let's just avoid the pigs. We did encounter two students who encountered a pig in the reeds and started running in hip-deep mud, which is very funny to watch, by the way, to get back to our boat, and flopped into the boat. And we said, what's that about? Said, oh, we heard snorting in the reeds, and you said if we heard that, that was bad, so we ran away. Okay. And then the one student turns to the other and said, do you really think in all that mud we were going to outrun that pig? And then she said, honey, I only had to outrun you. And so this is what's left of the vessel, and this is what it looks like. And I have to be honest, in my entire career, this is the only pretty boat I ever excavated. I've mostly dealt with big flat-bottom scows, but this one was nice. I really want to. Kristen, are you looking for stuff to build?
Yes, please.
It's 45 feet long, so it'll fit on your ways or in your shed. Got a big, powerful rig, would have been used in the Chesapeake Bay, and we have all the construction drawings. And it would be awesome to sail it. So, and it's built out of live oak, cypress, and pine. I know Joe likes working with live oak, right?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. And we then backfilled the site. We built a bulkhead around the end and piled that 90 tons of mud back in there with 4 people. Gravity's your friend then, you're shoveling it into the hole, not out. And this is a Google Earth image from a couple of years ago, and our bulkheading worked, still there. Proud of that. Little seat of the pants engineering. And then the major project I did while I was at Texas was this. How are we doing on time? I could talk all day. Oh, good. And this was a medieval wreck that I directed the excavation of for 4 seasons between 1995 and 1998. It's an amphora wreck, which is a very typical kind of medieval or classic Mediterranean wreck. Cargo of wine or olive oil in clay jars, which are basically indestructible, and they're readily identifiable on the bottom. We've never found a ship carrying grain or rock salt, because you can't identify it on the bottom of the sea. It just disappears. But this one was readily findable. So it was lying on a slope from about 95 feet down to 120 feet, which in Texas A&M terms, that's easy baby diving. So we didn't have to, we used mixed gas the last season, but generally it was fairly easy. It's located here, the same general area as these other wrecks, where it had piled into a cliff and then sank to the bottom of the cliff. And so we excavated the wreck here and then lived in a camp in an old olive grove here. The only comfortable camp that INA has ever built, by the way. The founder of the Institute thought it made us all soft. You have to suffer for your art. So all the excavations before and after, they lived on the side of a cliff in a remote place with no water and lots of mosquitoes. No, you don't have to do that to do good work. So we built a nice camp. That was always the first part of the season. I thought it was important that all the students who were going to participate in this have some practical experience of some sort, just to get them used to the idea of working with their hands. American kids who grew up in the city can't pound a nail straight for the most part. And now that, now there's probably an app for that. But so the students would build the camp every season, including doing the wiring, doing the plumbing, so that they knew how the camp functioned. They understood about how you did basic tasks with wood and metal, which would then inform them later when they were doing other things. We even dug our own septic system, but I'll tell you, you can't have archaeologists dig a septic tank because they have to stop for every little potsherd and bone fragment and discuss it. So this was the world's slowest septic tank. The excavation platform, we stuck to the side of a cliff. This involved the students, once again, breaking rock and hand mixing about 15 tons of concrete to build a place we could dive from to get to the site. Because the site is straight down 95 feet. And if you step off of the dive platform, you swim out 10 feet and go straight down and you're on the ship. And it was carrying a big cargo of wine, probably from the Crimea, we think. And what we discovered was fascinating when we got to the bottom layer is that all of the jars were still in orderly rows, just like they'd been stacked by the stevedores. That was cool. That's another hair on the back of your neck moment, where you can see that history or time has stood still for a moment. Main type of these really badly made jars that break really easily, unfortunately. Some of them still had their contents or had the stoppers in place. Out of 960 jars, 60 of them still had intact stoppers. 15 of those had no mud inside, only liquid. And 2 of them had red liquid inside. Yes, we tasted it. You have to. And our conclusion is 874 was a really bad year. It was clearly not seawater, it was a decomposed organic product. It had a lot of grape pips in it, hundreds of grape pips in every amphora. So if you're the kind of person who likes pulp in your orange juice, you're going to like this kind of wine. We also found well-preserved organic material, olives in a jar, and we even found one jar that was full of whole, juicy grapes, 1,100 years old. We didn't taste those. Not very much nice stuff. It was all very utilitarian, except for this glass carafe and 3 little wine goblets, which we found broken, of course. This stuff is light bulb thin. And my main interest was the hull remains from a couple of hundred years before the wreck I told you about before, so we successfully raised those. And a student of mine then took that on as his dissertation project. But he had to be there to do the raising, taking the sampling, so he got a very visceral feel for what these timbers are like. And so we had most of the starboard side out to the turn of the bilge, really, and a little bit of the stern. Typically, this is all of INA's other wrecks in Turkey. It's always the port side. Don't know why, but we're the odd man out with the starboard side. But one of the things we were able to do is to reconstruct how the ship sank. We found amphoras underneath the ship, which indicated they had been jettisoning cargo to try to lighten ship at the last minute. And they got to the bottom before the ship did. We only found 1 anchor all the way at the bow. And we know medieval ships of this type normally carried about 10 anchors. So they'd already tried to anchor and cast all of their anchors. And so it dragged into the cliff because the ship hit stern first. And from 4 seasons of sitting on that rock, we knew what the weather patterns are like. And I had to have this argument with one of my colleagues who's one of these imagined experience people, talking about weather patterns, and this is what happens. So, well, but what actually happens at this very spot is, no matter what the wind is doing in the rest of the world, it either blows this way or this way, because it hits this big escarpment and turns around the end of this big escarpment and comes up the bay. And so it blows this way, westerly or southwesterly, until the wind clocks far enough around to get around this escarpment, and then it blows southeasterly. And the change happens in about 10 minutes. And so if you're riding that southwesterly to get into the harbor and you're here when it swaps over to northeasterly, yes, thank you, you're screwed. And so they did not manage to turn quickly enough and run back down the channel and duck in here. They got driven onto the cliff in the wind change. I'm pretty sure what happened. But I wouldn't know that if I hadn't spent years sailing on ships off of rocky coasts. And in fact, our artist even did a painting of the sinking. She's a talented person. This is all done in auto body touch-up paint, which is the only thing she could find at the hardware store. So it's Ford blue and Caterpillar yellow for the most part. Very quickly, once I moved to Scandinavia, I excavated a medieval ship, the Calling Cog, built in 1189, spring of 1189. Dendrochronology, you can count tree rings. We can tell the wood was cut in the winter of 1188-89, and we can see that all of the big, wide, tangentially sawn planks had split down the middle while they were building the ship, which means they built the ship with green wood, so it was built in the year after they cut the timber. And it had been partially excavated in 1943, and we finished the job in 2001. And it's one of a number of cog medieval transport vessels found. Working off of a stone fissure. In Denmark, there's no bedrock, there's only glacial moraine. If you need rock for riprapping, you hire a stone fisher to go fish for rocks in the water. And so this was an excavation we did in Denmark in March, because the visibility is good in March. You just have to break through the ice occasionally and shovel the snow off the deck. And this was in using commercial gear. So we're doing the really important job. We're tending divers who are underwater. And for this project, the most important guy is the guy who provides the tea and coffee. And got to do really heavy-duty, rough, tough diver stuff here. I hate diving. My ideal diving equipment is if I could dive naked, because it just gets in your way if you're trying to do archaeology. And it's riding the bus to work for me. And the less commuting I have to do, the better. And then this was the awful job of sieving stuff. All the water we were pumping up from the bottom had to be gone through. And so this is not just standing outside in the winter, it's standing outside in the winter being showered with freezing water with rocks in it. We dismantled the hull and recovered it. 57 timbers, 8 tons of timber altogether. This is the underside of the keelson mast step, and then packed it all and transported it for documentation. And then a student and I spent 2 months drawing all of these in 3 dimensions with a Faro arm, a coordinate measuring machine. That's what I was doing in Denmark the afternoon of September 11th, 2001, when we heard on the radio that there'd been an explosion at the World Trade Center. So I know what I was doing on 9/11 20 years ago. I was recording those timbers. And this was exhausting work. This is the tiredest I've ever been in my entire life, was moving all this timber, because nothing weighed less than 500 pounds. And this is what was left of that ship. Plus loose timbers from the upper works, which made it possible to reconstruct a cross-section. And there's a group in Denmark that's now building a replica of this vessel. And this is probably about what it looked like. About 90 tons displacement, about 65 feet long. And this was the first wreck that we used digital documentation of individual timbers, drawing them in 3 dimensions, which was a technique that I helped develop and the thing that was important here is people are convinced that scanning will save the world, that you can record everything by scanning. And here's my rant. If I take a picture of you with my camera, I have a record of what you look like today, but I don't know anything more about you or understand you any better than I did before I took the picture. I just have a picture. Documentation by itself is meaningless. You have to understand what you're documenting. I can teach a student to use this tool in 2 days. I can't teach them what's important to record with that tool in 2 days. That's where you need the experience of looking at lots of ships. Ideally, you need to understand how to use an adze in order to recognize an adze mark in a timber. And so a large part of the teaching I did was teaching those practical boat building skills in the classroom. And we did manage to achieve a certain amount of other advancement in that project. This is a timber that was raised in 1943 and being photographed for record. And this is us photographing in timber, you'll notice we now have a 4-wheeled wagon instead of a 2-wheeled wagon. And that brings us to Vasa, where I'll finish. I'm not going to talk a lot about Vasa. Get me back some other time to talk about Vasa. But everything we do at Vasa is related to that blending of practical and academic knowledge. You can't understand how the ship was built if you don't know how to build a ship. And so looking at this ship, which is all assembled, we can't take it apart. I would love to, but they won't let me. We have to try to infer some things, looking in cracks through the seams to see what the framing is like, that sort of thing. And Joe and Sam have gotten to enjoy this, crawling around inside the ship, trying to figure out how things were done, what's missing, that sort of thing. But this vessel is more or less intact. It's about 98% original timber from 1628. So we have a lot of data to work with. We even have about 2/3 of the rig of the ship left. So a lot of your blocks and deadeyes look very familiar to me. But I'll talk about one particular project we did in 2013-14, which was to figure out what the performance of the ship's armament was. And we went to the academic ballisticians and said, can you use your ballistic math to tell us what the performance of this gun is? And they said, no, we can't. Our theory is based on data. You're using a muzzle-loading smoothbore tube with a loose-fitting projectile and a propellant that no one's used in 100 years. We don't have any math for that. Said, but if you would make one and shoot it a couple hundred times and record it, we could use that math to develop a mathematical model of what's going on, which is exactly the answer I wanted to hear. And so in 2013, we cast a new Vasa 24-pounder and then made all of the accoutrement for it because we have the entire system preserved. And then built a section of Vasa. There have been lots of tests of old artillery, and what they usually do is they build a wall with some vertical studs and some planks to represent a ship side. That's not how ships are built. You need to build an actual ship to understand how a ship behaves when you hit it with a cannonball. One of the things we discovered is that the structure matters. The way the structure is put together has a huge bearing on what happens inside the ship when you hit it with a cannonball traveling at the speed of sound. And so this is our first shot at the hull. You can even see the cannonball. That's it right there. Trailing smoke. It's really like a Wile E. Coyote cartoon. It's traveling, the photographer got very lucky because it's traveling at the speed of sound. 340 meters per second or 760 miles an hour. And it's about to hit this chunk of ship side and do this. Those bits of wood are also now traveling at the speed of sound. And if you were standing right next to it, you would be unharmed. They weigh so little, they won't go through your clothes. If, however, you hit one of those knees, the shock wave in front of the ball gets big enough to spall off chunks of timber that weigh 20 or 30 pounds, and they'll kill you. And so whether you get hurt or not depends on where your ship gets hit. And if you're facing a heavily armed vessel, your best defense is to be in a lightly built ship so that the splinters are small and harmless. And you'll just get a lot of holes punched in your ship. And if you are statistically unlucky to be standing right in front of the cannonball, well, then you're dead. But being hit by a cannonball was so rare that if it happened, people wrote about it. It just doesn't occupy enough space in the total volume of the battlefield. That on ships, 90% plus of all the casualties are caused by splinters. We know that from medical data from the Napoleonic Wars. And we could demonstrate it quite clearly in our tests. We also could see, and this is my last illustrative example about imagined experience and real experience. The gun crew we imported from the US. We imported the 2011 world champion in muzzle-loading mortar. There is such a thing. Championships are later this week, and that's where I'm going from here, because we imported my team, White's Company A, 35th Virginia Cavalry, that compete with muzzle-loading black powder American Civil War weapons. And so this is the accuracy picture. This is where all of our rounds landed, all aimed at that spot. And then we were firing rounds, and we had two mathematicians who were ballistics experts, and they were doing a lot of calculation work to figure out what was happening. And then we were going to fire at a chunk of wood or armor plate, and we needed to know where to aim. And so we established the aiming point, and then where do you actually point the gun to hit that spot? And they went and ran their calculators and said, based on the wind resistance, velocity with this charge, the ball is going to drop this much, so you need to aim 20 centimeters directly above, 8 inches directly above that spot at this range. We said, no, we're gonna aim about 5 inches under it and to the left. They said, why? Because then it'll hit the spot. And so we fired, we aimed it where we said, and we bullseyed it. And so the math guy says, well, so you were aiming, 8 inches above, right? So no, like I said, we aimed 5 inches low and a little bit left. They said, why did you do that? I asked him, when you were calculating the flight of this ball, how many of the rounds we've already fired did you take into account? Well, none. I just used the tables that show the velocity and the drop. So we, on the other hand, who are professional shooters, we've been watching where every ball lands, and we can see that this particular cannon hits high and right relative to where you aim it. So using Kentucky windage, we compensated and aimed low and left so that the ball will actually hit where we want it to. And that's really what this kind of thing is about, is having that kind of practical experience, that knowledge in your hands of what really happens in physical interactions, how tools are used, how clothes are sewn, how meals are cooked, so that you can draw an accurate conclusion from what you find in the ground. You can recognize what you find in the ground and understand how it was used, and then interpret what people were doing. And that's the source of accuracy. Thank you. I have never given a talk like that. It was really weird. The title of the file is Fred's Greatest Hits. It's vaguely embarrassing, but there you go.
It shouldn't be, Fred. It shouldn't be. Fantastic.
And right on time. Excellent.
We have a few minutes, and I can't tell if this microphone's working. I think it's not.
I think so.
Question.
Yes. I have a question. Fred, are there techniques of building that you have unearthed over time that you've been able to bring back into use in the industry?
No. And that's because the techniques that we've discovered in the past were horrifically labor-intensive and inefficient. And so the only time they're used is if you're replicating an historic vessel.
Like Dove?
Like Dove. Well, in Dove, if we were building Dove the way the original Dove had been built, it would not be framed the way it is. But the way the original Dove was framed, you build up the framing and planking in alternate bands. And if you haven't ever done that before, there's a lot of trial and error in the process, which just would not have been efficient here. And so in this case, the focus is on getting an accurate hull form using a framing method that's a little bit later that gives you better control over the shape. If we use the original framing method, which none of us have ever actually done, I built a model that way once, and I can tell you from building a model, it's really sensitive to how well you know what you're doing, because you're designing on the fly as you go. And one of the things that we have to do here is we have to be able to produce a hull form that the Coast Guard can approve, that you can run some kind of stability analysis on in advance. And so and in order to make the project financially viable, we have to be able to accurately estimate materials, that sort of thing. And so these older methods of construction, while they make very good ships, generally speaking, all the ones I've encountered are not viable commercially in a modern yard because they're so labor intensive. And they're from before people used drawings to design vessels. That's a difficult sell to a museum director when you're trying to get a project approved and budgeted to say, well, we're going to build it and it's going to be about 15 feet long, and it's going to be shaped kind of like this. And no board of trustees is going to approve that budget. You need to, the way we make decisions doesn't work that way. And so we need to use a method that was developed largely in response to the growth of professional administration, who needed to be able to administer the process of building ships for navies or big companies. And they needed to be able to judge and evaluate the design before you bought any timber, so that they could minimize waste in the timber purchasing process, so they could know how many men, just so they could plan.
Are there other questions? We'll go to Lloyd first.
When Joe came back from visiting the Vasa Museum, he had an opportunity to go into the ship and look how the inside of the ship looked compared with the outside. The outside was beautiful, it's the Queen flagship, but he said the inside was less than perfect, with the timbers lying all over the place. Is that typical how they built them?
Yes and no, depends on who built them. In Northern Europe in the 17th century, there are two main construction traditions in use for medium and large size ships. One is actually not a Northern European product, it's a Mediterranean product. And that's the method that later went on to become what we know as ship design, where you draw the ship on paper, you figure out the cross-sectional shapes so you can make frames, and you set up frames and put planks over those. And for that to work, your frames have to be exactly square to the keel, they need to be evenly spaced on stations lines and that sort of thing. And that was practiced in France and England very much. We tend to talk about it as the English method. It's also sometimes called whole molding, because of the way that you develop the whole form. But there was an entirely separate tradition left over from Roman times in the Low Countries, the way the Dutch built ships, in that they designed the ship as a planking shell. And they put together the bottom planks of the ship, edge to edge, fastened them together temporarily with cleats to get the bottom, and then put framing into it. And their design method was based on, you started with two primary measurements, length of the keel and the maximum breadth. And everything else was derived by proportional rule from those two dimensions. And then you use that to put things together. But if you're not using the frames to determine the shape of the hull, they don't have to be square to the keel. It doesn't make the ship any stronger if the frames are perfectly square. And so what you see is that very often the frames are skewed a little bit, because what the Dutch are fond of, a good ship to the English is very consistent in its details. Frames are all perfectly 8 inches sided and 9 inches molded. All the deck beams are 9 by 7. And that they're all evenly spaced. That's a sign of quality, of craftsmanship. In the Netherlands, it's a sign of wasted money. In the Netherlands, the sign of craftsmanship is using the material efficiently. And so if the tree will give you a deck beam, if your nominal deck beams are a foot square, but the tree will give you a beam that's 14 by 11.5, go with it. If you cut another 2 inches off just to make it 12 inches wide, you're wasting material, and you're wasting the time it took to remove the extra 2 inches of material. And so what we see in Vasa is there's no standard size for anything. The deck beams vary. They don't sit square to the hull, they fit where they fit. But the joints are all tight. It's all high quality work. It's just a different idea of what high quality is. And at that point, regularity has no functional or economic advantage. So it's abandoned as wasteful.
We have another question.
Yeah, I volunteer here as mechanics assistant and involved in putting the engines in the dub. I got to thinking about a ship that was designed in the early 1600s. As a naval architect, do you spend a lot of time worried about vibration, thrust, heat, all the things that engines do that this ship was never designed to accommodate?
Well, there's a couple of different aspects to that. If you built a very traditional, truly traditional 17th century hull form, it's not designed to be propelled by a power source below the water behind the ship. It's designed to be propelled by wind in the sails. And that applies forces in different directions than a propeller does. And so the problem with a sailing vessel is that the wind tends to push the bow down. And so what you see in 17th century ships especially is they tend to have relatively full bows and fine sterns. Whereas a power vessel tends to make the stern squat. And so you need to have some fullness in the stern to keep it from squatting under power. And trying to accommodate both of those was one of the design challenges throughout the 20th century when people first started putting engines in sailing vessels. And trying to make a vessel that will sail and power well is a real challenge to the naval architect. And so there is some compromise in the design of the stern of Dove. It's not shaped exactly the way the stern would be for a 17th century English pinnace in order to avoid that squatting problem. But it does still have the full bow that you need because you're going to sail it. You can't bury the bow in a wave. When it comes to vibration, they discovered in the early 19th century or early 20th century when they started putting power plants in clinker-built boats, lab-strake boats, they really don't like power plants because the vibration sets up at a very small level vibrations at the rivets holding the planks together that enlarges the rivet holes. And so they start leaking relatively early in their careers. And one of the reasons that clinker construction was abandoned in Scandinavia around 1910 was so that people could start putting diesel engines in their boats. But carvel construction, such as used here, is very well adapted to power. And people built wooden ships with power. Fishing boats have been built that way for over 100 years now. Steamships were built that way already from the 1840s in wood. And so carvel construction, if you build it properly and you bed the engine properly, is not normally a problem. Although what you do discover with power vessels as opposed to pure sailing vessels, the places they start to leak first are different. My experience with sailing vessels is they start leaking at the bow first, and power vessels start leaking at the stern first. And people who work with both we could have that would be a good survey to do, is to find out what's your experience there. Anyone else? Sam?
I have a kind of general question. In your professional conversation with colleagues regarding the premise of this presentation, have you faced any antagonism when it comes to it being sort of a grounding philosophy of archaeology, or has there been, other maybe competing arguments that would maybe steer young archaeologists away from this particular interest and focus?
Yes. I have encountered pushback from people who think differently. There are plenty of people in the world who believe that if you read enough books, you can understand something completely. And there are plenty of subjects that are purely theoretical, particle physics, or cosmology are very theoretical disciplines. And mathematics is essentially a purely theoretical discipline. Math is an abstract concept. And so it's perfectly valid to think that way. And where I've encountered opposition is when it's worked out that someone has come to a very particular conclusion based on imagined experience of thinking logically through a process and imagining what would happen. And very often that comes up when somebody makes the claim and phrases it, it would have been easier to, and my question to them always is, what do you mean by easier? And how do you know? How do you know what's easier for someone else? Well, carvel construction is easier than clinker constructions. If you know how to do both, no, it isn't. You can do both. They're equally easy, and they both have their applications. What can we say archaeologically? Because I don't know what's in anybody's head. I barely know what's in my head. Psychoarchaeology of dead people is just beyond the pale. But what I can say is, building a ship of a certain size this way requires this amount of this kind of material, and building it this way requires a different amount of a different kind of material. I'm going to build a clinker boat, I need high quality planking stock, probably radially converted, in order to make that ship work, because it's going to depend on its planks as the main structure and the fastenings between them. Whereas if I build the same boat as a carvel boat, I can get away with slightly lower quality wood, and I don't need as wide timber, because I have a lot more choice in how I plank that boat, and I can build it more heavily. But I might need a different kind of timber and a different amount of it than I would need for the other one. And then I can do a calculation of what those would cost if I know what the timber market is like. And I can say it will cost less to build it this way than to build it that way. But I might also then be able to calculate that this one will last 10 years longer than that one. So if you're thinking about the initial capital cost, you might go that way. If you're thinking about the eventual long-term cost of capital, operation, replacement, repair, you might go this way. I can't say easier, but I could make an argument about which is a better economic argument if I know what factors you are weighing. And that's a lot of my research is around that question. How do people make the decisions they do? What factors do they decide are important, and how do they weight them? Because if you and I get posed the same problem, we're not going to come to the same solution. We might come to similar solutions. We have different experience. We have different preferences. We probably have different ideas, and we might do things slightly differently. And we might both produce equally good boats. But that's going to be based on our individual practical experience of having done it. You know, I might have built a ship once with 2 gun decks that was a complete disaster and sank on its maiden voyage, and I might decide I'm just not going to build any more ships with 2 gun decks, like Vasa. Or I could be the guy who took over Vasa, who looked at that and said, I think I understand what's wrong here, and instead of, I think we can build this, but we have to completely redesign it. It needs to be much bigger with fewer guns. What I encounter in archaeology is people who are resistant to the idea of having to use knowledge they don't have. When you come with that argument that I've built a ship like that and this is what wood actually does, there's not really a counter argument to that from a theoretical perspective, and that can create discomfort. You know, you're challenging somebody's ideas about how they think the world works. And when you're trying to make an argument, and my argument is always, let's draw conclusions based on evidence, not supposition. When I review articles for journals, whether they should publish it or not, anytime I see the word, we presume that, well, in other words, you're guessing. You know, tell me what your evidence is. Just back to what I said at the beginning. Has anyone actually banged their head on the underside of the ship, or are you just imagining that could happen? Yes, it is physically possible for someone to do that, but has anyone actually done it? And I've always preferred to start with the evidence and an understanding of the physical process and go from there. But there are other people who reach equally valid conclusions who don't start there. They start at the theoretical end and work towards the physical end. And that's also perfectly valid. And you end up meeting somewhere in the middle, and I have to be aware that there are theoretical issues at play that I might not be interested in, but are perfectly valid. I have to accommodate that theoretical end of the argument, but that other person also has to accommodate my practical end of the argument as well. When I worked in Denmark, we used to call the boat builders who worked at the museum our craftsman researchers. And it was important that we listened to what they said when they were building Viking ship copies, because they were testing our theoretical ideas about how you did stuff. And occasionally they would come to us and say, well, that doesn't really work that way. They used to love teasing this one English archaeologist who would always come up with these really elaborate ideas of how somebody did something in the future. And I remember once he came with and he was a craftsman too, to a certain degree, but he wasn't a professional craftsman. He was a guy who liked to fool around with tools. And he had been wondering, when you're building a clinker boat, Viking style, and you've got a rivet, a nail, and a rove, a washer, and you drive the rove down, and then you have to clip the point of the nail off. And so he had wondered how you did that in the Viking period. And so he'd worked out a way with a hatchet and a hammer to set the hatchet against the nail shaft and hammer it, and then set it on the other side and hammer it, and then bend it back and forth until it broke off. And he came and demonstrated this for the boat builders at the Viking Ship Museum. And they said, huh, yeah, I guess that does work. We use these. Copy of a nail clipper, basically a pair of wire cutters, which is a copy of one found in a Viking tool chest from the 9th century. So this is much, yeah, your method will definitely work, but this works much faster. So, and they enjoy, playing that game.
All right. Well, I think we're about out of time, and I want to thank all of you for coming, and especially Fred for making it all the way here to visit us and see Dove and share some of your career highlights with us.
Thanks, and I'm really glad to be able to see Dove now after sitting in enough Zoom meetings to talk about it, and answering emails from Joe and Will and Sam, so, and Ivor.
All right. Thank you to all of you, and a reminder that our Dove Symposium will start virtually tomorrow. Jen Doldy, our curator, is going to present the first of our sessions. I hope that you're able to join, and if you have any questions or want to register, then you could email Rachel, who I'll point out to you. She can help get you registered for the symposium. Have a beautiful day, everybody.